Hello, Niel Hiscox, publisher, Canadian auto dealer, here today with Barry Hillier, CEO and founder of Catalytic Technology, a technology incubator and accelerant for the automotive industry. Here to talk about the impact of the pandemic. Barry, we're in an industry that was being transformed by tech, arguably gradually before the pandemic. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on how one influences the other. How do you see the pandemic impacting the types of tech the industry is going to need to adopt and the rate of adoption?
Thanks, Neil, and thanks, everybody. Appreciate your time in watching. I'm really sorry for what this industry is going through right now, because the changes, the short answer is they've been expedited exponentially. It's all of these things were already impacting. We had societal change, we had environmental pressures, a lot of new technology changes, and a lot that have actually been coming into fruition in the last few years. So, as technology is being developed, if you were to look at things like blockchain, it takes a long time for it to get going, but then all of a sudden they hit this point where they figured a lot of it out and it starts to get rapid adoption. And then you've also got a lot of the economic pressures, and not just COVID, the things we're already experiencing with the gig economy, with the Airbnb effect, the Amazon effect, what people's expectations were in terms of brands, behaviors, their relationship, data, privacy, all these things. And COVID has just put it in a nice, neat, tight box. Some are going to look at it as Pandora's. Some are going to look at it as a tremendous opportunity. But it has sped this up at a rapid pace.
How are we going to see that impact? Let's put some foot into some different silos. So, for instance, from a retail tech customer experience standpoint, there's going to come a point where customers are allowed back in the door. There's a debate as to whether they'll want to go back in the door. Talk a little bit about tech from a retail standpoint.
From a retail standpoint, I think what we're going to see are a lot of new technologies. For instance, things like RPA, which is robotic process automation or hyper automation, and how that's going to impact the retail experiences. It's dramatically going to change the front end and the back end experience for consumers. The whole process of automation is allowing all of your systems to be automated so that you are reducing issues such as all of a sudden I booked a service appointment to have my tires exchanged, but nobody caught my tires weren't there. There are going to be a lot of things operating in the back end that are going to work through a lot of the complicating issues that dealers are experiencing every day. Blockchain is another example, being something that's going to change the whole notion of the need for a wet signature, because you've got all of these new technologies that are going to improve the fundamental experience that consumers have been very vocal about for not just the last few years, at least the last 10.
The term wet signature is one that I've heard more in the last couple of weeks since COVID hit than I heard probably in the 2 years before that. Talk a little bit about that. I mean, there's a technology aspect to that. There's also a regulatory aspect to that. Talk a bit about both sides of that.
I think you have different forces that are at play. Automotive is such a huge industry in every country. It is one of the key pillars that keeps our economy going, and everybody needs to be mobile. And so you have the automotive industry itself trying to protect some of the history and processes and the way that things are, to make it so that you can't just purchase easily an online vehicle. But like a lot of pressures, it's all about when do you hit that tipping point? When is tech fully ready? So that way it removes any of the issues such as data contamination or privacy issues or security issues. And at what point does societal and consumer needs, and even from that standpoint, environmental, why do I have to do all this back and forth to the dealership? Why can't I do it at home? So you're going to see a consumer pressure that's hitting the automotive industry in the same way that, and I love our teachers, but there was a lot of issues about whether we should have online learning. Well, obviously, that's going to be hard to put that genie back in the bottle. In the same way, people are seeing how strong all of these online opportunities in terms of what I'm purchasing, how I'm researching, are dramatically changing now that we're all stuck in our homes.
You had mentioned there was one Honda dealer that you had mentioned as an example. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, Paragon
as well.
Yeah, it was in a CNN article, and I wasn't surprised when I saw, I believe it's Brian Benstock from Paragon Honda, his photo. He's always been very much ahead of the curve. In fact, during the 2008 crisis, he was one of the first that was doing cash for your trade-in kind of initiatives. Very, very far ahead. He had, according to this article, started to work through entire process and online purchase workflows, and he was beta testing them 4 months before COVID hit. So even though, if you compare that to a lot of e-commerce that's happening right now, that was quite late in the game, he was, I think, always a little bit earlier. And I'm sure there are a lot of other dealership groups doing very innovative things. I know Kevin Fry with the Weiler Group has been doing some very, very interesting beta tests also. So there are a lot of dealers that have started to accept and take in technology, change their workflows, utilize this to improve not just the customer side, but also the employee side, removing a lot of the menial tasks, a lot of the things that just drag the men and the women that make this industry function. That's just dragging them down from being more productive and getting more out of their day-to-day job. So it's going to be interesting to see what impact this is now going to have, because it's not one area. It's consumer, it's employee, it's operations, it's economic impact, and it's political change as well.
And maybe one of the outcomes of the pandemic is at a time unlike anything I've seen, we have the collective and collaborative attention of all levels of government. Certainly in Canada, I think that we've done well with that, which for the regulatory side of it, there's probably never been a better time to affect change. You've got everyone at the table.
Well, and I think there's a lot of alignment right now, not just on all the tiers of the government, but if you look at all the tiers of the associations, CADA, you've got TADA, you have all of these groups that they're working really, really hard to find solutions, and they're pushing for ways to start to educate. I know there's a huge education initiative by both TADA and CADA. And I think that's also what it's going to take, because it's easy to say, adopt all this tech, or we need to make these changes politically. They need to get implemented. So it's going to have a pretty big impact. So how do we manage that change through training, education, and a lot of patience? Because this is a dramatic business model shift. It's not just a workflow shift.
Give me your sense of who you think some of the winners are going to be coming out of this, not necessarily by name, but by sort of fairly specific offering or category.
Well, I think when you're taking a look at anything that's collaboration based, so we're already seeing it with things like whether it's Teams, Google Hangout, Zoom, how people are going to be connecting together and adopting that tech, moving that then into other collaboration style tools, whether it's Slack, Confluence, programs of that nature. But then when you get into very, very specific technologies, I think blockchain, I think hyperautomation are going to be two really key areas that will dramatically shift the landscape, because they're enabling that business model shift, the process shift. And I think the other aspect of this too is there's going to be a recognition of not having the super enterprise system. Because I think on the one hand, as much as it simplifies things down, when things do go poorly, it makes it harder to actually react. So I think we're going to start to see Not necessarily that the enterprise systems are going to go away. Some of the winners are going to be some of the larger, more niche style technologies who are demonstrating flexibility and nimbleness in terms of being able to adapt to these situations. Because there's going to be a lot of pressure, not just on the automotive dealers, but current vendors in each of the different sectors. Just because you were the principal share winner in the past does not mean that you'll be for the future.
Yeah, this would seem, we've been throwing the word disruption around for years. Mm-hmm. In now a disrupted industry, a lot of opportunity, potentially. Where would you be looking if you're a dealer and you've got a bit of time on your hands now to perhaps do some reading and exploration to try to understand your next moves, your strategic opportunity? How would you spend some of that time? Where should people be looking? What should they be looking for?
I'd be looking outside of the automotive sector. I'd be starting to read, after you finish reading Canadian Auto Dealer.
Good man.
You're welcome. You're welcome. After you finish Canadian Auto Dealer, then sit down and start to go online with something like The Logic or Beta Kit. But these are all of the sites that are starting to give information about what's happening in other industries, great case studies about how businesses are starting to adapt. And I think also starting to attend things like collision conferences. They are great ways to get a ton of workshops in. I know you guys were at the inaugural Toronto issue. And that's a great place for you to not only see smaller vendors, they have a very large automotive section also. But when you get outside of the automotive section, that's when you're starting to see what are the tools that other sectors are using. So the starting point for me is to actually stop looking inside auto and start looking outside auto, because that is a big part of what's driving all of the expectations for employees, potential employees, and consumers.
Is the level of disruption that the automotive industry is facing and the obvious impact on numbers going to make the industry a less tempting playground for players outside the industry, or are they going to see that as an opportunity?
That will depend on how the automotive industry shifts. I think a big move that we're going to see is dealerships that have 1 to 3, even 1 to 5 rooftops. It's going to get harder and harder and harder for them to really keep a decent profit margin for the costs that are going to be involved. They're probably going to be hitting a value to the families, to the owners, sooner rather than later. That's going to hit more of a peak once we get past this, the COVID situation. But you're going to see a big shift because those rooftops are going to get bought by groups that are going to get larger and larger. And as you see those groups, not only are they playing the numbers game, but by incorporating and shifting who they hire and running these companies like the billion-dollar enterprises that many of these are, you are going to be able to attract the same level of executive that Procter & Gamble was getting, or Unilever was getting, or Google was getting. But what will require is going to be a shift in mindset in how are you going to be operating that enterprise? Is it going to be operated rooftop to rooftop using the same process and principles that people have been using for the last 3 decades? Or is there going to be that dramatic shift? And in the same way that Steve Jobs was able to attract outside the industry before Apple became Apple, it was all about, do you want to help change the world? And a lot of the shifts that are happening in the automotive side are shifts that are really impacting the world in a much larger way than I think a lot of people are recognizing, because we're not selling vehicles, we're selling mobility. And especially if you're in an urban area, that notion of mobility is going to shift. So if dealers are going to still be relevant, they're going to need to have people that are going to be capable of leading through that dramatic change in how that group needs to operate. So that was a convoluted answer, but I do think it's going to be a huge opportunity because these positions pay well. We all know that internally. The reason that we're not necessarily getting some of the executives from P&G is they are used to much more stringent ways of approaching business planning operations. And once we can get past that little disparity in terms of the two groups and how they see how businesses get run, you're going to have people that are going to turn this industry into something that I think is going to be its second golden age.
It's exciting stuff, and we could talk about this for ages, and I want to just start to wrap it up. We'll be doing this again sometime, but I want to leave it with one thought for a dealer principal or dealer principals all across the country. You have a bit of time this afternoon. What's the one thing you think they should do today?
To be honest, I think what they need to do is find an area that there's nobody around them and take 60 minutes to themselves and just take a deep breath and recharge. I think everybody in times like this is jumping into some form of action as opposed to just being able to take a moment and reflect. I know the pressure that dealer principals are under right now, and that stress, that emotional stress, that physical stress, that spiritual, that mental stress. Give yourself permission to take a moment to yourself, because I know they've been taking care of their families and their employees and their customers for the last month plus, depending on where you are. They can take an hour.
I think that's great advice. Let's leave it at that for now. I look forward to our next conversation. Barry, thank you very much.
All right, appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, Niel Hiscox signing off.